because we have a couple people not here. All right, here we go. So making the world safe for typography. Now it's a little bit of audience participation. What is happening here? What are we seeing?
Or Japanese.
What's happening to it? What's wrong with the typography? What should we be worried about?
Is it stretched?
Who said that?
I did. Sorry, I
Yes.
think I cut someone off.
Well, you're right. Stretched is right. It's stretched. You can see it's stretched because what? What do you notice that's making it so you know it's stretched? What's it doing? What are the strokes doing?
The vertical
you-
strokes look like thinner than the ones that are like horizontal.
Right. So the stems are thin. The weight of the stroke is thin, but then you have the shoulder of the N here is really exaggerated and heavy and thick, much thicker. And this is a geometric typeface that should be perfect circles, right? And they all should be the same weight all the way around. So you can definitely see the stretched type. What's happening here?
That's also stretched.
Right, it's stretched so much that we are not even sure if it's a Z or a 2 or what it is. It's so severely distorted. So these are all on signs, right? So these are things people have spent a lot of money on to put outside their point of business. So we're going to continue. A growing gap. What is happening on this sign or awning? What are they doing? They're taking commas and centering them in the X height between these words. So they have a giant gap, and then they're like, oh, let's just fill that gap with a comma that we're going to put floating in the middle of the X height. Makes no sense. Okay, here is a newspaper, which I know you guys probably never see, but here's a newspaper. What's happening in this newspaper? Who can tell me what the problem is here?
I can't remember exactly what they're called, but I think like islands, or not islands, but there's a lot of, they force justified it and it is making a lot of random spaces.
Correct. They're making random spaces, which we call rivers, where the word, and then these words are actually all lining up perfectly, right? The what is best for the, which you also want to avoid. Okay, what's happening here? What's the type crime here?
Did they use the, what is it called? The hatch mark instead of an apostrophe?
You are right. They used a hatch mark instead of an apostrophe for Jack. What do they do for John? Same thing, right? It's a hatch mark. What do we use hatch marks for? Who can tell me? What do we use this for? There is a use for it. There is something that's useful for it, but it isn't being used correctly here.
It's for unit of measurements.
It's for what?
A unit of measurement.
Measurements, exactly. It's used for measurement. feet, you would be putting this like 6 feet, right? It would be after the FT or feet, 6 feet. 1 hash mark is feet. 2 hash marks is inches. So yes, it's used for measurements. They're using it as an apostrophe. It is not an apostrophe, but this is happening over and over again. Even St. Joseph's is using a hatch mark instead of an apostrophe. They need us to help them. As designers, I can't in good conscience put you out into the world graduating from a type class without knowing the difference between an apostrophe and a hatch mark, because apparently sign companies don't know the difference. Andy is using a hatch mark. Ben is using a hatch mark. Ava is doing a hatch mark, or Eva. Mike's hatch mark. And Mary is using a hatch mark. Even God is using a hash mark. Steve, Ray, they're all using what we call dumb quotes. When people use hatch marks instead of curly quotes, we call them dumb quotes. Nope, it's not acceptable in hand lettering either. You have to use the proper quotation mark when you're drawing. So that's called a dumb quote. When you see a hatch mark being used versus an apostrophe, it's a dumb quote. This is what an apostrophe looks like. Curly is using an apostrophe. An apostrophe has a weight top, the hook on the end, right? It's like an upside down, or it's like a comma moved up, right? It's curly. We call them curly quotes. But alas, so many places, this is like multiple crimes, right? Here we have a dumb quote, vertical text with an apostrophe, like too many things. And here's what's really unfortunate. Here we have Harry, and the awning has a dumb quote, and the painting on the window, or the vinyl on the window, has the curly quote. So they had it right on the window and then did it wrong on the awning. And here it's done correctly in marker on a little marker board, right? You can see the curly quote there, properly done. But there's the sign, the actual sign above this business with a dumb quote. So we don't want to be dummies. We want to make sure we're using the right quotes when we're setting our type. And it gets worse. So it's not even bad enough that people are sometimes using hash marks. Here's an example of a curly quote used backwards. Here's another one used upside down and backwards. And now here's what's crazy. So what's going on here? Who can tell me what's?
They're upside down on the 6.
The 6, what are they using? What should they be using here? This is a measurement. What are they using?
They should be using a hash mark.
That's right. They should be using a hash mark here, and they're using a backwards curly quote. So it goes both ways, is what I'm saying. Is sometimes here it should be a hash mark. It's a measurement. It's 6 inches. Deep dish pizza. So it should be hash mark. Lucky. Really? Dumb quote.
Or like unlucky.
Exactly. Exactly. So the basic thing I want you to walk away from this is knowing when we use a hash mark and when we use a curly quote, and not to confuse them. All right, we're going to talk about typographic nitty-gritty, just a little bit more things to consider as you're getting to know more of the rules of type. So we are getting into, we're going to be starting to thinking about pairing typefaces when we get into our next project. So how do we think about typefaces and hierarchy? One of the things we're going to be thinking about and focusing on is hierarchy. So I have these two labeled, a good type and a bad type. Why? What makes one good and one bad? What's happening in these two examples? Who can tell me?
There's not enough contrast between the text on the left because the body text is bold and the heading is not, and there's not a lot of space in between them.
Absolutely. The body text is bold and the headline isn't. And not only that, the body text is also all caps. How difficult is it to read a whole paragraph of type in all caps? Whereas if we look at the good type choice, they put the headline in all caps. That's okay. To read a few words in all caps is pretty easy to read, and then have upper and lowercase for the whole body, which makes it much easier to read. Reading a whole paragraph or a whole page in all caps is difficult to read and makes us feeling like it's like they're yelling at us, right? But we don't feel that way when it's just a headline. So here's an example of too many typefaces versus just two typefaces. When some people want to show lots of things that they want to highlight in whatever it is that they're communicating, they sometimes think, oh, we should, change the typeface or add a different size or make it bolder. The more different elements we bring in, it just makes it look confusing and messy versus just focusing on the headline, one typeface, and the body, a second typeface. You don't need more than two typefaces in this scenario. Contrast, another one of our design choices. Bad color contrast is dark color with dark type. Very hard to read. Good color contrast is a light color with dark type. So it's easy to read and it highlights, it doesn't take away from the work. So we're making sure whenever we're adding color, and we're going to be doing this in this project, we're going to be putting our designs on a photographic background. So we're going to want to make sure that we have good legibility of our type when it's on top of a color or an image. Always thinking about contrast. Contrast is a design principle we always want to make sure we're considering. Hierarchy is another design principle we're going to be working with. So bad hierarchy means we don't know what order to read this in. When there's not good hierarchy, it's confusing. We don't know where to go first. When we have good hierarchy, it's very clear what's the first read, what's the second read, and what's the third read. When we start setting type in paragraphs, especially using flush left typesetting, we're going to be looking at the right edge, which we call a rag. And so on the left here, we have something I'm calling a bad rag. And on the right, it's a good rag. What do I mean by bad and good? What makes it bad and what makes it good?
It's bad because it's like going in too far and out, but in a good rag, it has a good consistency.
That's right. And it doesn't feel like there's holes in the copy, right? That one on the left feels like there's literally holes in the copy. You lose your place. Our brain, when we have the type with a single line kind of zigzagging out so far, it loses its place reading that copy. If you just try to read that left paragraph versus reading the right paragraph, one is so much easier to read than the other. And that's because of the rag. Now, justified text versus not justified. Justified text means you're edge to edge. The type is being pushed to hit each edge. But what happens when we have justified text is we get rivers, these white spaces that you can imagine if you were just pouring water through the top, the water would come trickling down and create these rivers, which are not that attractive because we have all this weird spacing. So when we choose which one would we feel more comfortable reading, which one do you think would be easier to read in this scenario?
The not justified one.
Right, the not justified one, because it's not so many holes again. It's fixable what's happening on the left, but they didn't fix it. So the way it's as is right now, it needs to be edited and adjusted. And it's the width of the column is too wide. It would need to be narrowed so it could actually work better. Now this came up earlier. Danica used the word orphan. So this is what an orphan is. We have a paragraph and one word ends up at the bottom. Just one word. But you can see there's like this big hole up here and some adjustments. We want to change the tracking of this paragraph so that we can pop this word beans up next to jelly, so that we don't have a orphan, which is a word all by itself ending at the end of a paragraph or on its own line. That's referred to as an orphan. Sometimes it cannot be avoided, but in print production, we always want to try to avoid that because it then will leave a hole in our layout where the rest of there's no words on this line. So we want to avoid having one single word at the end on its own line. Now, another thing we want to avoid is when we are flowing copy from paragraph to paragraph, when we get the end of this left paragraph, there's three little words on their own line and going up to the top of the next column. That's called a widow. And so it also is going to leave a weird hole because it's like not very much. It feels like this paragraph should end over here on the left. So we would want to either move more words over to the right. So there's maybe 2 lines of this paragraph to the right, or move these 3 words back over here by, again, adjusting the tracking and the spacing and kind of resetting the type so that we can fit all of those over to the left, or bring more over to the right to give us more than 1 line. So we'd have at least 2 lines. But a single line of type from one paragraph at the top of the next column is a widow. All right, so here's what we just learned about smart quotes versus dumb quotes. We want to be very aware of what we're using, smart quotes or dumb quotes, when we're setting our type. Looking at spacing, double spacing versus single spacing, and being aware of how you're setting the type for your spacing. Not that you can't do one or the other, there's just 2 choices. Sorry, I'm referring to something else. The double spacing I'm referring to here is actually the spacing after the period. Notice on the left, the word beef has a big space before the word chuck. On the right, there's a single space. The double spacing we're referring to here is a rule that was taught back when people were taught how to type on a typewriter. Typewriters were monospaced. How many of you were taught when you were learning typing on a keyboard that you should put 2 spaces after a period? Anyone here still taught that? A few of us might, but most of us shouldn't be anymore, but I think that's still happening. So Sarah, yep, you were taught it. Anyone else was taught that? Just Sarah? That's what I was taught as well. And it's because when we were using typewriters and teaching how to keyboard on a typewriter, typewriters are monospaced. So you always had to put 2 spaces after a period on a typewriter. But now that we're in digital, that doesn't exist anymore. Digitals are not monospaced. So, but there are some people, and they're usually going to be in an older generation, that are either teaching it, they've either taught it to you, or they are using it because that's how they were taught, to put 2 spaces after a period. I actually have a client I'm working with right now that always does it, and it drives me crazy because I constantly have to fix it. So if you receive copy from a client, a lot of times your clients are going to be, you know, they could be much older than you. They might still be doing this. So if you get copy that has multiple spaces after a period, you have to go in and take them all out, take out the double spaces, because that's a type crime. That's no longer do we use double spaces. The only exception to this is some contracts in the legal industry, in other words, lawyers, some contracts require a double spacing after periods because of the legal laws of the way they write their contracts. So there is an exception to this rule with some legal contracts that require a double space. But in anything we're working on, when we're designing any copy that's going to be on anything that's designed, there's never a double space after a period. What do I mean by too many signals here?
I think like bold text draws people's eye to it. So it's like saying this is important. And when you have like so many things, it kind of negates the importance of it if it's just like half the text.
Right. And there's more than just bold text, isn't there? What else is happening if we look closely? What are we all seeing happening? They didn't just pick one way to highlight something. There's italics, there's all caps, there's underlines, right? There's all kinds of things. That's a huge type crime. So if you see this out in the world where there's like an ad with all these different ways to highlight an information, all of it just becomes a jumbled mess and it just looks messy and no one wants to read any of it. So you choose one thing, one way to signal a change in the text. And then you also use it sparingly. You don't use it for half the text. So you're right about that. We don't want half the text highlighted. That doesn't make any sense. But regardless, you only choose one way to do it, not 5 different ways. Okay, that's my last one. All right, good. So what we're going to be doing for part of our reflections this week is we're going to go out and look at things and say, what kind of type crimes can we find? We've just kind of gone through type crimes and some of this nitty gritty things to pay attention to. All of these are fair game in our quest to find a violation and to write some tickets this week. So that'll be what we're going to be doing.